probably get asked this question a lot, but why did you write this book now?
Well, I started about 4 years ago. And you're right. I'm asked this question almost at every stop. And I finally got to kind of hone in on, kind of a much more concise answer because there was a myriad of reasons why I think, that led me to writing this book and to, telling the stories that I tell in the book that are both personal and professional, but I think in many ways so incredibly relatable to so many people. But there were a couple of really primary, kind of impetus points for me. And one of them was, and they're very closely tied and related. One of them was we brought a group of interns onto campus.
Mm.
These interns were from our partnership with the Thurgood Marshall College Fund. And I believe this one in particular young lady, I remember her name was Ashley. I believe she was from North Carolina A&T. She was so excited. We were still at Infinite Loop at that time, not at Apple Park.
Yeah,
But Infinite Loop was, just as,
yeah,
much of
yeah,
a marvel, especially if you'd never visited.
yeah.
She landed, she was walking around, we were walking around with a few students, and she was looking around and she was just wide-eyed and she said, "I just can't believe a place like Apple would consider someone like me."
Mm.
And it honestly, it took my breath away, right? I was like, my God, of course we would consider, we want like
Mm.
hundreds of you. Like, why would we not consider someone like you? And I realized at that point that there was a huge gap in the story.
Mm.
What Ashley knew about Apple. Ashley didn't know there was a Denise, right?
Right, right.
And, what were the reasons why people didn't know that, right?
Mm.
So that's something that I had to really think about and reflect on. And I decided that that's a story that needed to be told. And
Yes,
it was
yes.
not okay that she had that thought. And it was not okay that she didn't know about Denise Young or Lisa Jackson or some of
Hmm.
the other, you
Hmm.
know, prominent women. There aren't a lot, we know this, but some of the other
Hmm.
prominent women, and the stories, we'll talk a little bit more about that later, of, these women in Silicon Valley. And then the closely tied, kind of story to that is, John, I was hugely involved in the creation of the Apple stores.
Yes,
Um,
yes. And it's so much a part, I think, Janice, of your book.
yeah,
There's so much. We'll talk about some of that,
yeah.
right?
But
The
from the
credo.
from the inception, and my role in that was to, kind of create that internal environment with the teams, with the talent, with the culture, and kind of integrate all of that so that you got that kind of transformative energy. And when, millions of customers
Mm.
per store walked into an Apple store anywhere in the world, they had that transformative experience. And so we
Yeah.
worked really hard, to develop that. But if you were to Google the Apple stores or the history of
Hmm.
the Apple
Hmm.
stores, you get really great information. You get information about the architects, about the design, about,
The
kind
look and feel, right? The look and feel of the store. Yeah.
feel. You'll get information about Ron Johnson and maybe about Mickey
Hmm. Yeah.
Drexler, but clearly about Steve. You'll get, information about Bob Bridger sometimes, but there's
Yeah.
this lineup of people. And what is so incredibly definitive about the Apple Store experience is the culture and the cultural
Yeah.
experience
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
how you feel when you go in, and that kind of gap that you feel with
Mm.
technology is closed
Yeah.
because of
Yeah.
the talent of
Yeah.
that. And I thought, how fascinating that when you Google it, you don't get
You
my,
don't get that information, right?
you don't get anyone who worked
Mm.
on
Yeah.
those areas.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, is that because again, we stop at the kind of lineup of, like wonderful, talented
Hmm.
guys,
Hmm. Hmm.
do we stop there? Or do we somehow subconsciously, um, kind of diminish, the kind of people and cultural aspects of
Mm.
that,
Mm.
because suddenly it becomes broad or opaque or it was just Apple, or just kind of happened
Yeah,
magic,
yeah,
you
yeah,
know? And
yeah,
I decided, you know what? People need to know
yeah,
that there was work, that there were
yeah,
systems, that there was effort, the same amount of effort
yeah, yeah.
and commitment and dedication that went into the design and the strategy and the thought went into the culture.
This is such a good time for us to talk about, just designing that credo. And it fits so well, I think, Denise, with our theme of setting the tone for a thriving culture, the culture of the Apple Store, right? And when you read your book, you just can't help but get just that focus on the word empathy. It's used so many times in your book. Can you talk a little bit about empathy, particularly with the Apple retail example and the credo, and making this a priority for Apple Store leaders? This is kind of the behind the scenes stuff that makes that store experience so magical for people.
Yeah, I mean, it's, the thing is, we treated it as a very kind of natural and organic way of doing business, and of, the filter for our business. And it was a human centric
Hmm.
approach. And I do talk about empathy a lot in the book. I even have one chapter dedicated to
Yeah, dedicated
that,
to it. Yeah.
the fact that it is, so often and so frequently misunderstood. And I talk about the fact that there's just this kind of misnomer and mischaracterization of the word. People,
Mm,
there's some close synonyms. There's some, close words like sympathy, compassion, but then people have
mm,
this kind of miscast um, placement of what they believe empathy is. Sometimes people will believe it's lack of accountability. It's overly forgiving, it's
mhm,
absolving. You kind of
mhm.
all these kind of ancillary, kind of ideas around empathy. When you kind of look at it technically in the kind of leadership,
Mm,
lexicon, empathy falls in the lineup of soft skills. And
mhm,
then there's a
mhm.
whole background around, and this is something that I did teach at Cornell.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah,
what can we reframe? And there have been a
yeah,
lot of conversations about this, but can we reframe this idea about what is soft and what is hard? And
yeah.
John,
Because empathy is hard too. I mean, soft skills are hard
Absolutely,
skills,
absolutely. And
aren't
so
they?
what we did is to reframe this idea of empathy. Of course, it's
Yeah.
all about emotional intelligence, right?
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
empathy, instead of some of these other kinds of, closely synonymous words that aren't quite it, what we did is kind of really recast and reframe it as empathy
Hmm.
is a gathering of information that helps you with context and perspective,
Hmm.
and you use that information to understand perspective. It is an essential business skill for the 21st century. So I
Hmm.
think that everything that we've learned about, soft skills, hard skills, I think we need to kind of switch that over into
Yeah.
a different category, or maybe have a third category, or maybe like erase those categories at all. I did a quick Google search the other day, and did you know that the origin of the hard and soft, I thought it was kind of the business school, kind of
Yeah.
business
Yeah.
school ideology. It actually came from the military, and I haven't fact checked this, but this is what,
Yeah.
2 or 3
Yeah.
Google searches
Yeah.
said. It came from the military, and what it was the hard skills were related to your ability, your tactical capability with weaponry.
Mm.
It truly
Hmm.
was a hard skill,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
soft skills were everything else.
Mm.
And so over time, it morphed into these kind of categories of soft skills. But the problem with that is that there's this immediate kind of mental clicking, kind of bias that we do when you say soft, that
Yeah.
nobody
Yeah.
wants to
Yeah.
hear
Yeah.
soft,
Yeah. Yeah.
you know.
It's
And
fascinating, Denise, to think about
it's
all of
been
this.
problematic over the years that
Oh, yeah, for
people
sure.
have not wanted to accept it. You can even see it, when you talk about it
Hmm.
with people, they
Hmm.
kind of have a mental
Yeah.
shift.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
like, oh, now we're going to
Yeah.
talk about the soft stuff. And now
Yeah.
let's go back to
Yeah.
the business, and it's
Yeah.
just,
Yeah.
no, they're
Yeah.
one and the same,
No, they're one and the same. And in our coaching work, we find we work with both, right? How
Yeah.
they come together, the work on the strategy, the engagement of people. Um, interesting, Denise, to think as I listen to you talk. I mean, there's so many risks that our listeners are experiencing, right? There's so many risks around financial risks, market risks, fundraising, world risks, right? Events of the world, right? I mean, there's so much going on, but they're people risks as well. And we sometimes forget those people risks. And I would love you to talk a little bit about some do's and don'ts around the people risks that you would want leaders to know about, and particularly with our investment community listening, and what can they do to help set the right tone, because they're seeing things within their founders. They see things when they're in the companies. They see things around the environment, sometimes the toxicity, the lack of sort of awareness of things going on with their teams. They get these voices. What can we
We're,
do? What can we do?
I mean, I could go on for a really long
Yes,
time about this,
yes.
as you know, but I will try to really be concise around what I think is really, really important. Of course, these are smart leaders and they know
Yeah.
that there are inherent costs. It is so incredibly expensive to have constant misses, on your people,
Mhm.
around your talent. It's so expensive to have to rehire, retrain. Smart leaders, of course, know this, right? But there's so many intrinsic costs that are really difficult to measure. And when you lose those, you lose so much traction and the ultimate
Mm,
viability and ultimate performance that you're really aiming for, with your business, with building your technology, et cetera. When you lose trust, I mean, we learned
mm,
this during,
mm,
we learned this from the pandemic. I think on the other side
mm,
of the
mm,
pandemic, it was so much new learning about the importance of prioritizing the human experience and prioritizing people, because no matter what business, service, product you offer, people are at the helm, at the center of it. They are the underpinning of it. And there's just nothing smart about not understanding that and not
mm,
prioritizing that.
mm,
And then as leaders, I think that we sometimes get so bogged down. It's so demanding
mm,
for leaders in this day and time. My heart goes out to, some of these leaders that I work with or coach and talk to, who are trying to they have so far more demands than they have capacity, and they're constantly trying to stretch that. They're
mm,
constantly trying to reconfigure capacity. And, people are always telling them, well, you have to do this, well, you have to do this. Well, there are new, business processes, there are new technologies, there are new things that you have to learn.
mm,
And so they're constantly having to deal with this, in addition to us telling them, and you have to put people first, and you have to do this,
mm,
and you
mm,
have to see people, and you have to know people. And it's really, really tough. And I think that they get so overwhelmed, and they it's really a challenge for them to kind of take a step back and breathe and say, you know what, let me just
mm,
really understand for myself and my
mm,
business what my top 5 priorities are.
mhm.
And people is always going to appear in
Yeah,
that top
yeah.
5. And I think what a lot of leaders miss is how reliant the entire organization is on them. Everything from their external mood, from their energy, to the language, to
Mm,
the
mm,
words they're using, to who they interact with, to how they interact with, to the quality
mm,
of interactions,
mm,
every little thing. And you and I have talked as recently as yesterday, we
mm,
talked
mhm.
about I love referring to the Rutgers study, the famous Rutgers
Yeah, we talked
pri-
about that. You might
primate
mention that
study.
because that's dynamic around coaching people, right? Around
It
their
is,
how
and
they show up as
it's
leaders.
it's such a fundamental,
Yeah,
kind of tenet, and it's so easy to understand.
yeah.
And this study of primates, the way that primates kind of collect is in concentric circles, and their leader is typically at the center. Their leader or leaders are typically at the center of that circle. And this study and several studies over years determined that the collection, the pack, if you
Mm,
will,
mhm,
would glance at the leader in the center of the circle every 26, 27 seconds for, just
Like they're in this fishbowl, right, Denise?
constant, right? Every 27 seconds
Uh,
for their cues
mm,
on how to
mm,
behave, what to do, how to think, where to go, how to live, how to feel. And,
mm, mm,
I'm not saying that we're that reliant, of course,
mhm,
but
mhm,
um
mhm.
the the patterns um, of the cultural patterns that
Yeah.
leaders don't realize that they are
Mhm,
responsible for
mhm, mhm.
um, is pretty significant. And so I think leaders, sometimes when they're overwhelmed, um, and they're not taking the time to kind of like take a step back and take a breath and say,
Yeah,
let me reprioritize. Sometimes you
yeah,
have to reprioritize like 6 times a day.
yeah,
Sometimes you can do
yeah.
it weekly, whatever your system is,
Mm.
but you really do have to take a moment to understand people are watching. I'm
Yeah,
responsible
yeah.
for so many things. I'm responsible for end to end how
Mm,
people
mm.
experience the culture of this group, this project, this organization.
Yeah, yeah. So how do Denise, with that, how do we coach? How do you coach others to coach people around these things, right? And when you think about it, I'm just recently have experienced a situation with one of the people that I'm coaching who has really brought in a much more diverse team. And there was a lot of pressure to make the team more diverse, the team scaling, et cetera, and diversity in all ways. But now I'm getting more feedback that yes, the team is more diverse, but in talking to the team, they don't feel like their voices are heard. So it's really an interesting dynamic. I mean, the intent was there,
Yeah.
but, and again, some of these people I think will leave. So I worry about that. And so, how do we coach this, right? And what suggestions might you have to deal with these kinds of dynamics that we all see going on?
Yeah. Well, there are a couple things, John. One, what I talk about in the book is this idea of seeing
Yeah.
when we are seen. I've told several stories about kind of important moments in my life, in my personal life, where I felt like I was
Hmm.
seen, I was understood, and the
Hmm.
impact that that had on me, that I in turn reciprocated. And that's just a thread of my upbringing that I brought into Apple and into my work at Apple. And what I realized was that it kind of worked for everybody. There's an
Hmm.
over reliance, I think, upon authority. There's an over reliance, I think, upon, within any group, within any organization, there's an over reliance upon others, whether it's HR
Hmm.
or leaders or decision makers, to kind of tell us what to do and how to do these things,
Hmm.
or
Hmm.
set rules or set guidelines. And we kind of give agency over to them when there's so much that we can do,
Yeah.
every
Yeah.
single one of us,
Yeah.
in terms of engagement, connection, context, and community. You know,
Hmm.
every
Hmm.
single individual who part of any organization can own that,
Yeah.
within
Yeah.
their
Yeah.
within their reach. And I
Mm.
think what leaders can do is give people permission and space and time
Hmm.
to do
Hmm.
that.
Yeah.
Everyone
Yeah.
will say,
It,
okay, who has got time to take on any more, things? But you know what? We do it when we set the intention to be more expansive about certain things. We find
hmm.
ways to do that.
Hmm.
Because
Yeah.
something,
Yeah.
something, something is going to move, something is going to reshape. Some things are going to become more synergistic, some things are going to be integrated. We can do it if we decide that it's that important.
Yeah.
And it
Yeah.
is.
Yeah. And it's interesting how so much of our work at Velocity is holding up that mirror, right? And so when you're getting feedback that things are not working with the team, voices are not heard, issues are not being discussed, being discussed outside, but not in the room because of a lack of trust or the perception that I'm not being heard, we often will hold up that mirror, right? And it's interesting how the work that I've done at Apple. I mean, it's funny because people at Apple that get a coach, and this might lead us into this, are individuals who are on the fast track, and so Apple gives coaches to their stars, which is really a good thing. I'd love you to talk a little bit about just the role of coaching and when to get a coach all that happens and how all this can actually lead to really good training and development, which was a big part of your life, that focus on learning and coaching. Yes.
I think that what we did in the stores, John, was similar to what you're saying. We would almost counterintuitively, especially because, those early years, the stores were, not as profitable as they were in later
Yeah.
years.
Hmm.
The product line, when you think about concurrently what the products look like over the course of that time, the product trajectory, you know,
Hmm. Hmm.
escalated, and so the stores did as well at that time. But especially in those earlier years, it was a little bit more challenging. But we never, from the very beginning, never varied from the idea that you invest, during um, downtimes. You invest disproportionately, especially with your leaders. You give them incredible amounts of tools and systems. Um, I think that one of the reasons that we did that is because we didn't want that over reliance on an infrastructure that we were never going to implement, right?
Hmm.
So building greater capacity, within leaders was just the strategy. But we found over time, that the leaders really grew with that, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
And so there was this kind of, when you talk about a coach, it was systemic, that the
Hmm.
coaching strategy, the tools, and the processes were kind of built along the way,
It wasn't this thing that happened kind of outside of the system. It was really built into the
it was
work
built
and the
it was built
goals.
into,
Yeah.
it was human systems. It was built in,
Yeah. Yeah.
kind feedback systems
Hmm.
and communication systems, and
Yeah. Yeah.
all of the things that we know, make a healthy environment, make a healthy, kind of communication flow, and help to build and foster trust. And we just kind of made that systemic, and it
Yeah.
ultimately
Yeah.
made systemic impact globally.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so you could go to any store, you could go to a store in Istanbul and a store in Ohio and get the same experience, because
Yeah.
those
Yeah.
leaders, were
Yeah.
developed in very similar ways.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
so, and both culturally and, their leadership competencies, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I think that, the idea of coaching, as you know, for so many years, it was considered a kind of problematic, it was an intervention.
Yeah. Yeah.
You
You got
had
a problem,
you
and
had a
yeah, that's it.
high
You need a
you had a
coach.
high
Yeah.
performer, and, "Oh my god, they're going the wrong direction. I gotta
Hmm.
get them a
Hmm.
coach." And, who feels great about that? Who's really going to emotionally invest in, "I'm not
Hmm.
even gonna hear you," if I already know that I'm a problem, I'm guarded, I'm
Mm.
not really allowing, the information to
Yeah. Yeah.
permeate. I'm not
Yeah.
really taking it in, because I'm too busy defending.
Yeah.
And so,
Yeah.
that's just not, along the kind
Hmm.
of leadership development continuum. That's not the right place to hold an
Yeah.
intervention.
Yeah. Yeah.
You want to do it as early as possible. You want to do it, of course, when you identify great potential. You want to do it when people change course, when people are
Hmm.
expanding. There's just so many great opportunities and ways to build leadership capability using coaching tools, using coaching
Yeah. Yeah.
systems, right?
And being proactive about that, right, Denise?
Right,
I mean, for,
absolutely.
for us at Velocity too, particularly work with so many of the investors, we like it when it's like they've been given the dollars, right? And it's like the investors step back and say, now it's time for a coach. And it's not done as a result of a problem. And
Right.
of course, they have challenges, they have problems to solve, but getting in it early. I think we started Velocity because we wanted early intervention. We wanted to start with founders and teams and
Absolutely.
cultures early, set that up early. And that's so much a part of what
I
you're
I
saying.
I think I think that was also, when I think about it, that was a large part of my role at Cornell.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
title is executive in residence, but what I did is I spent, Cornell Tech is the graduate school technology campus on Roosevelt Island in Manhattan, related to the main campus in Ithaca, for
Hmm.
those who may not be familiar with it. And just some of the smartest folks I have ever encountered. They are going to be our tech leaders, of
Of the
tomorrow.
future. Yeah.
And I was so excited to spend that time with them, and I felt like I was, in essence, a coach because what I was is
Hmm.
they were in early development of these exciting technologies in
Hmm.
health
Hmm.
tech and fun tech, and just all across industries. And I was able to spend time with them in their product development, kind of courses that
Hmm.
said implement the human-centric components of things now, whether it's your
Yeah. Yeah.
technology, whether it's your business process, whether it's your service offerings, start thinking about this and the accountability for that now. You don't want to be at a place where you have to unravel it later,
Hmm. Hmm.
and become a Silicon Valley story. You want to be the, the story that people talk about that says they
Hmm.
got it
Hmm.
right, or
Yeah.
the story that
Yeah.
people don't have to talk about at all because it's already inherent to what you do and who you are. And that's what those young leaders really started to aim for. And they got it. They got it, which was really,
Yeah.
really
Yeah.
very
Yeah.
gratifying for me.
I think that's fascinating. And, interesting. We were talking yesterday about this and uh, the idea of coaches and mentors, but we were talking about Tim Cook getting this question from a student around mentoring. And I've thought so much about that. And would you tell that story? I mean, there's so many
Sure.
beautiful things about Tim Cook, as we know, right?
Yeah,
This
yeah.
was one that just, that people might be interested because it really talks a lot about being seen, being heard, which is such a theme of this book and a theme of this conversation, setting the tone. Yeah.
And it's really kind of an example of, as you just said, setting the tone, um, empathy, you know, not in that kind of typical contextual way we think of empathy, but empathy in terms of in that moment, assessing and gathering the intelligence and reframing the question, right?
Hmm.
But here's what
Hmm.
happened. It was an all hands meeting, an employee meeting. And at the end of them, Tim would typically open up for questions that
Questions. Yeah.
people could ask of him, or he would, hand them over to his front line, his executive team. And there was a young man kind of in the back of um, the cafe. I believe at the time I may have recognized him as being either from one of the stores or one of the call centers. But he was a young man, raised his hand. Was just beaming,
Mm.
clearly an employee who, loved life and was happy to be there, but raised his hand. I could tell, this was a very courageous thing for him to
Mm.
do, was to like
Hmm.
raise his hand and ask a question of the CEO. But he raised his hand and he asked a question about mentoring. And he said, he was excited about being at Apple. He was excited about the career that he hopefully had before him, but there was so much he didn't know, so many different opportunities and things he was interested in. How could he get a mentor, or how did Tim feel about mentoring?
Hmm. Hmm.
And so Tim was reflective and thoughtful, and I think he was thinking about himself and his career. And that I think that had been part of the question, to be fair. And he said, I never really used mentors. I didn't really have mentors. I kind of learned from everyone. And, I think that that's what, people, have the opportunity to do when you work at a company like Apple and there are so many smart people around. You just kind of learn from everybody.
Hmm.
And that was a fine answer. But I think that if Tim had recognized in the moment that here's this kid who's just so far away from where a Tim Cook was, or
Right. Right.
had a very different career trajectory and
Yeah.
cultural experience than a Tim Cook might have had in
Yeah.
his
Yeah.
career.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, that what I really wish that he had said was, well, for me personally, I had this experience,
Mm.
but I understand and recognize this is a big company. There are a lot of
Mhm.
things that, that seem mysterious,
Mm.
to young people up and coming. What do you think would be helpful? How do you think that, we can come up with a
Mm.
mentoring program that's going to help you? Here's two couple people you can talk to.
You could talk
You
to.
help
Yeah.
us, you help us design
Yeah.
one.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
have, I think, to kind of turn it to what are you looking for and
Yeah.
what you
Yeah.
need? you
Yeah.
know,
Well, we
would
talk
have,
about being curious, right? I mean,
yeah,
I
yeah,
would love to have seen Tim in that situation become curious. And that could have been an interesting, very short
yeah.
interchange around
And Tim's
curiosity. Yeah.
response wasn't, Tim's
Oh,
response was
yeah. Yeah.
fine. It was
Yeah.
thoughtful, it was reflective, it was his experience.
Hmm.
But in the moment of having this kid who couldn't have been, beyond his 20s, in the
Yeah.
moment of having him and knowing that you have a whole demographic within the company
Yeah.
folks like that who are listening, like, oh my God, what's Tim Cook going to say about mentoring? You know,
Yeah. Yeah.
in that
Yeah.
split second. And this is the challenge for this audience today as tone setters to
Mm,
understand that people are always listening, people
mm,
always are
mm,
watching, people are always seeking
mm,
ways that they can improve and enhance their experience. They don't feel like they have always the same advantages or access to
mm, mhm.
information, the
Yeah.
same
Yeah.
understanding. So they're always seeking that. They're always looking
Yeah.
for that.
Yeah.
And so for
Yeah.
leaders, you may not know, you know, all the layers, all the organizations, all the complexities that exist within your own culture. But what the tone setting can do is giving permission for people to be curious, for people to
Hmm.
find that out, for
Hmm.
people to extend. You're not closing doors culturally to
Yeah.
say, well, this
Yeah.
is selective or exclusive information that only certain people can know, that you're not explicitly saying, but you're saying
Mm.
that with
Yeah.
your tone.
Yeah. And to be aware of it's not just your words. And certainly words are important, but so much is communicated by the nonverbal, the meta communication parts, the way in which the pauses, waiting to hear somebody's response, coming back to it to understand it better, say more about that. So,
Oh my
Denise,
gosh,
it's
I've been,
interesting. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. Go ahead.
John, you
Go
and I
ahead.
have been in meetings. I'm sure that we can remember, but I can recall so many meetings with senior executives, with
Hmm.
with an array of levels of employees, with senior executives. And when the meeting disperses, and a collection of employees will have the meeting after the meeting, and
Yeah. Yeah. Right.
they
Right.
will try to dissect, okay, what was said, what are our go
Yeah.
forward
Uh-huh.
directions. But then there's also this kind of whole, kind of dialogue around, did you see, who John was watching in the meeting? Did you watch his
Yeah,
body language?
yeah, yeah.
They watch everything, and they
Yeah,
try to,
yeah.
extract
Hmm. Hmm.
meaning for themselves,
Yeah, yeah.
in everything from body language to who someone was talking to, who they were making eye contact with. And it's so unnecessary for them to have to go
Hmm.
through that. And I
Hmm.
think if we
Hmm.
can, as leaders, if we can be a little bit more conscious, we're human like everybody
Yeah,
else, but if we
yeah.
can be a little bit more conscious and cognizant of the fact that people are watching that, and
Yes.
if we
Yeah.
can, by our demeanor, by the language, by the words that we use, if we can shorten that time to thrive, because people
Yeah.
just want to hurry up and get to the point where they know more, they have more
Yeah. Yeah.
information,
Yeah.
they can be a
Yeah.
part of a community, they can be a part of a team that's going to
Mm,
win. That's what they
mm.
want. They want to get
Yeah.
into a situation and a culture where they can thrive. And
Yeah. No, I think that,
there's so much that we
yeah.
as leaders can do to kind of set that tone, establish that,
Yes. Yes.
like a
Yes.
parent that can set that
Yeah.
tone in the home, or a teacher that can set that tone in a
Yeah.
classroom. Leaders
Yeah.
can do the same thing, and VC partners can do that with an entire portfolio. So there's a whole ripple effect
Mm,
across the
mm,
valley,
mm.
across the country, across the world, that they can have that kind of impact,
Yes. Yes.
right?
Yes. It's so interesting about thriving, right? It's not just about creating cultures that thrive, but leaders have to thrive themselves. They have to be good with themselves. Your opera, all of that. I mean, interesting. This is a little different sort of tack to take around this conversation, but I mean, we do find that leaders who are good with themselves, that are taking time to sort of just step back, look at the things they need around their health, their just in general, all of that. Thriving in opera. How does all of that fit for you? And what can we say to leaders who need to invest in themselves to thrive?
For me, there was so much synergy around my art and my
Mm,
work.
yeah.
It's fortunate that I worked in a creative and innovative environment. I mean, that
Yeah.
was a
Your
match.
company is so
Yeah,
creative, right? I
yeah,
mean, the
that
match
that
there
that was
was
a match, right?
always
And
there,
and
right?
and
Yeah.
that was that was the kind of profile that we drew. So
Mhm.
when we were in the retail stores, when we had a part-time population in retail. Traditional retail, that's a seasonal, that's moms and, working
Mhm,
part-time and,
mhm,
and that's kind of been the tradition. Our part-time profile was everything from, script writers, it was teachers, script writers, musicians,
mhm,
artists.
mhm,
And so, we were fortunate that we drew and attracted, that kind of creative spirit. But for me personally, what was so synergistic about it was that, my operatic world, my singing world, my music world was all about storytelling.
mm,
Um, and I felt like so much of my work was about storytelling,
mm,
and so much of the work that the stores did,
mm,
was about storytelling. When customers came in and wanted to know, what's the latest app? What are you using? You
mm.
know, what will fit on my phone?
There's a story behind that, right?
And so to be, for employees to be able to share these things and
Yeah, yeah.
share these experiences. So, there was just so much synergy around that. But I think even in businesses, that where, you know, they're maybe more traditional and maybe, less
Mm,
creative, I
mm,
think
mm,
allowing and giving leaders giving a permission for people to bring their right brain thinking
mhm,
and bring
mhm,
creative, thinking, creative problem solving, into any business situation is going to ultimately
mm.
benefit the business and the thinking and the
Yeah,
quality of
yeah,
thinking.
yeah.
I just firmly believe that. I've seen that, countless times, in multiple types of business and even in academia, right?
Mm,
I
mm,
think the creative mind, creative problem solving, critical thinking is enhanced when it is infused with creativity and innovation, and which is ultimately, as you said earlier, this idea of asking questions, exploring, setting
mm,
context,
mm,
telling stories, sharing connection. Those are all the kind of facets and
mm,
fundamental tenets that foster, this kind of an environment where human beings thrive,
mm,
where you get kind of these best outcomes around, no matter what your ultimate, kind of
mm,
remit as a
mm.
business is, you get the best outcomes when people
Yes.
can thrive.
Yes. We work a lot on that in coaching, not just the business side, but the personal side.
Yeah.
Denise, we're close to getting Q&A, but I would love to finish up with just some thoughts around the one thing you would leave with us about setting the tone for a thriving culture. There's so much that you've said today that I think we can all take away, but what would be the one thing that you would want to leave us with?
I think I've been asked this question in several different settings, but I think particularly for this audience, I think for leaders from this community to give your leaders, your portfolio companies, your charge, give them permission to take a breath, give them permission to feel, give them permission to be vulnerable. Um, Set the tone that is as much of a strength and as much of an
Mm,
asset from a human perspective as any other type of competence. And I think when leaders lead, with that mindset and that kind of
mm,
thinking, it opens up so much more human capacity. Um, I think that if you're not doing that, if that's not a front of mind way of leading, I listen to Mark Cuban talk about that a
mm,
lot. He's
mhm,
one of the people
mhm,
that I admire in the way that they are so profoundly competent in their business, but so ready and willing and able to be vulnerable and to be human and to give everyone around them permission to be the
mm,
same.
mhm,
That would be the thing that I would leave with people, and to make that a priority and make that front of mind and not
mm,
kind of an afterthought.
mm. That's so much a part of the book too, Denise. Your vulnerability and your truths do come out in a powerful way in this book. So it's one of those books that you just can't put down because it has so many stories in it. It's a series of stories, isn't it, Denise? Right?
That's a lot of
That
stories.
and it must have been. Was it fun to write or hard to write?
It was both. It
Yeah.
was both, John. It was very cathartic to in some ways to go back and relive some of the stories both professionally and personally.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
then I had another experience when I recorded the audiobook myself, with my
Yeah.
own
Yeah.
voice,
Yeah.
and kind of you forget about it. You know this as an author, you forget about the editing part of it because you're like, oh, did I say that? Did I leave that out? Did I leave that in? And you're doing this while you're recording or
Yeah.
while you're like
You're
in real
critiquing what you
time.
wrote. Yes.
You know?
Yes.
So
Oh
it was a
gosh.
really fascinating experience. I encourage everyone to um, tell the stories that are meaningful for you,
Hmm.
for your
Hmm.
life, for your community, for your family. They're important, and that's how human beings. That's where human beings. That's the point at which human beings connect,
Mm. Mm.
and it's the relational
Mm.
aspect of how we communicate. We relate to stories. We connect around them. So yeah, it was enjoyable, and there were a lot of stories that didn't, kind of get captured for this. Well, they'll be kind of like moved forward to a next
The next
opportunity.
one. Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. I think, Josh, I think we're at that stage. I think my timer says that we're probably time for Q&A. Is that right?
Yes, that sounds good. Wonderful. I got one question in my direct messages. If you could reflect on the opening of Apple stores in the early days, is there anything you would have done differently?
Mm.
Hmm. That's interesting. I think it's easy for me to say now. I
Mhm.
think perhaps not being as cautious. We were really, really cautious in those early first couple of years, and really just kind of like, a combination of fearful and fearless, you know, everything from the idea that nobody was sitting at the Genius bars, you know,
Mhm.
and now, you can make your way through them, right? And so I think if it was, it's like anything else. If you knew then what you know now, kind of thing. It's like, what do you tell yourself as a 5-year-old? You don't have to be as fearful. Everything's going to work out. So there are those kinds of things. I mean, there are a lot of kinds of kind of functional, um, kind of process and systems. You know, we learned so much. I think to our advantage, we were constantly learning. Um, and and I really think that there's really that's kind of a no fault process. As long as
Mhm.
you're continuing to learn and apply those learnings, that's what learning agility is all about, right? So I think we made a lot of mistakes. We, kind of reached a lot of kind of, you know, dead ends and glitches. We worked through them and we just continued. We just pressed forward. Um, yeah, so that's it's kind of tough to answer because we were just so determined yet cautious. I think a little bit schizophrenic, in those early years because there was so many things that we were, kind of trying to fulfill and
Mm.
trying to answer, for the company. There was the big narrative that, oh, this is never going to work, you know, to why are you being so counterintuitive around the traditions of retail?
Mhm.
That's not going to work.
Mm.
And everything did work, you know.
Yeah.
So, I don't know if that's the answer that people were looking for. I'd have to think more about that. I don't really have anything except to say that, we made a lot of mistakes. We learned a lot. We had a lot of bumps. um, we were cautious, we were, fearful, but we worked our way through it.
Mhm.
Maybe if I could look back and say, I wish our time to thrive gap were closed a little bit, I would have thought of ways that we could shorten that. But I think everybody has to go through that. Every growing business has to go through that.
Fantastic. Very well said. A question in from Tiffany, who is the director of people and talent at Sapphire Ventures. So I know probably an
Mm.
organization.
Hello, Tiffany.
Yeah, close to
Hi,
you.
Tiffany.
I love seeing this again. What is something each of you have learned from each other Oh, I love this because you can definitely see a natural chemistry, and it's clear that you know each other for a while. What have you
That's what
learned from each other, and that you might have implemented in your own leadership philosophy or style presently?
Mm. So I'll start, Denise. Being an academic and having studied leadership is wonderful, right? And so I think a lot about some of these ideas I had, particularly in my early coaching days at Apple, about leadership, but how much I learned from you in terms of just putting it into practice. You talked about it today. I just saw it all over you today. Just your presence. You have a presence that's magical, and I have worked hard on that as well. And so I've learned from you the nuances of the little things that you do that just communicate the context and the importance of the other person on the other side of the table. So the what was always clear to me, but the how is what I've learned from you is the how, your presence. So
It's interesting.
that's yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for that, John. I really appreciate that. I really do. Thank you. Um, I'm not sure I've ever even had a direct conversation with you about this. I think in passing we've talked about it. But one thing that you always did for me, one thing, Josh, thank you for whoever, Tiffany, for asking this question. But one thing John would always do is give me permission to kind of state the obvious. I'll give you an example. We'd be talking about something, we'd be trying to solve a situation and come up with some strategies and innovations. And I would say, but John, everybody knows that. Doesn't everybody know that? And he would look at me and say, no, not necessarily, and I would kind of go, okay, so am I the only one that sees this? And he would sometimes have to inform me, you might be one of the few people that sees this or gets this, right?
Mhm.
And so then how do you transfer these learnings to the people around you, right? And let's talk about a strategy for that. But it was just so freeing and so liberating, for you to sometimes say, um, yeah, it's only, you have a way of seeing things. And no, it's not obvious to everybody. And I just assume there's all these smart people, there's all these amazing, competent people.
Mhm.
Surely they see this. It's
Mhm.
like, well, no, this is your perspective,
Mhm.
and this is your gift, and this is how you see things. And you have this level of EQ, and you have this, this level of empathy, and you use empathy as a skill. So now, what kind of strategies can we use to bridge this? And
Mhm.
it was so practical, but it was so liberating to say, nah, no. And it was just, I don't know if I've ever shared that with you, that you were just,
No, you
it was
never
just
have.
so, yeah,
So
it
yes.
was just so, I would just like take us, it was just like a sigh of relief, like,
Mhm.
okay, well now I get it, you know? And
Awesome.
you, but particularly for someone like Tiffany, who is a people, if you are an HR and a people and culture practitioner, you sometimes see the world differently. You will sometimes speak, and I talk about this in the book, you will oftentimes speak a different language
Mhm.
than your your top line business leaders. And you have to find ways to bridge that.
Mhm.
You're gonna realize you do have some of the same experiences, but you don't talk about them and relate to them in the same way. And it's wonderful synergy, and you can come up with strategies for the organization when you are aligned around how you see or experience, a certain scenario.
Wonderful.
And so words matter, and
Oh
language.
yes, yes.
Definitely. A question from Brian. How do you intervene when these strategies, probably referring to what you had said earlier, when a founder has siloed leadership style, meaning they are product focused rather than people focused? That's a good question.
Mhm.
Well, I think you have to do you have to do some work around the why. You have to do some contextual work, with that leader, with that set of leaders. You kind of
Mhm.
have to take them aside and, really kind of get into the, why are you doing this? And I think this kind of rewiring and connecting to the why and to the purpose has more upside opportunity to align and to minimize the silos and minimize, that focus and open it up. It's not that you want to minimize the focus. Focus is a great
Mm.
thing. What you want to do is open, whatever the constructs of that organization, you want to open things up so that communication is spread across and the connection is spread across at some juncture. Um, Multiple things can be true at once, multiple things can
Mhm.
happen
Mhm.
at once, and multiple things can sit in a space at once. But to get people connected more to the why and the context, not
Mhm.
just around, their work and their reason for the work and their reason for being involved in this work, but others as well. And that's going to kind of force more of this kind of lateral, kind of connection and
Yeah. Yeah.
understanding and a desire for that because you realize, well, that's helpful, you
Mhm.
know,
Yes.
and when you
Yes.
realize that that's helpful, then that kind of that two-way, kind of communication, that mutuality, becomes more important and more essential, to how people, want to move forward. There's always the we can do it this way, but then there's like, but we really want to do it this way because this
Mm.
is going to be more beneficial to in so many more ways.
Fantastic. I hope you don't mind. I have a question myself. So this one's coming
Sure.
from me. I never do this in our webinar, so I'm excited to interject myself. Something that just struck me was just how long you've been at Apple. And, I'm part of the generation where people say, job hop, you can make more money, you can
Mm.
like,
Mm.
and I'm curious from your perspective, A, like what's the magic that's kept you at Apple for that amount of time? And B, what advice would you have for younger people who do kind of live in this kind of job hopping, like less
Mm.
loyalty, both from the company to person, person to company environment?
That is a fascinating
It
question to
is. It
ask
is.
myself.
We could do a whole seminar on
Oh,
I
that
yeah, that's a
one,
know. I'm
whole
sorry.
Raj.
But just, really quickly, I think for me, I was so incredibly fortunate, as were many people at Apple during the arc of time that I was there, because there was just constant change.
Yeah.
And it was the work that I was doing was intrapreneurial, right?
Mhm.
There was a lot of intrapreneurial work. There were a lot of incubative projects. There were so many things going on. That was the time when Steve came back around 2000, 2001, when Steve returned to Apple, and he had so many ideas around what he wanted to do, what he didn't want to do, how he was going to, shift things, and, how he wanted the products to be experienced, by the public, by consumers. And so it was a lot to do, over that arc of time. And so it felt like it was constantly challenging. It was constantly new. We were, it was uncharted territory. And so I think, when you're in an environment where you're doing, where there's a lot of same
Mhm.
over a long period of time, for creative minds, for people who are challenged,
Mm.
um, who are problem solvers, who are curious, sameness, doesn't work for them.
Mm.
And it doesn't work for people who want to grow, who want new opportunities, who want to lead, who want new challenges, who want to break through barriers. um they look for challenges, and they look for change, and they look for opportunities to do things that have never been done, before. Now there's another kind of thing that, kind of, I think, philosophy, that I talk to young people about, and especially when they're in big companies. um, there is a kind of mutuality. I mean, young people are not from the era, that kind of, maybe even predates me, where you kind of give you like everything, like every, atom and nuance, to a company or a corporation. I don't even think it serves the corporation for that to happen anymore. You want people who are whole beings, who are able to contribute in multiple ways. Um, and I tell young people, make sure that the company is working as hard for you as you're working for the company. And what that means is making sure that you're talking to them and communicating to them about opportunities to learn, opportunities to grow, make sure that you're being wise with your investments, make sure that you're like living a whole life where you're planning for a world where things look very different. Who knew that we would be faced, we'd be faced with a pandemic where post that the whole way of working, workplaces, workspaces, how we work, how we interact was going to be upended. Who knew that? Right. And so the world, we're going to be constantly faced with that kind of change. So I think, having this balance of making sure that you're gaining, that you're learning, that you're gleaning something, that is commensurate with the, significant contribution that people are giving, to workplaces today. That's a strategy that I think serves, your generation and the generations coming behind you. And then the
So
final thing is I promised my dad before he passed away, I promised him that I was going to work to a point that I was going to be prudent with my kind of life and portfolio and investments. I was going to work to a point where I was not all consumed. My father knew that I had a whole other kind of life of, kind of artistic, endeavors. And he saw me and recognized that. And he said, don't take that thread to the
mm,
end.
mm,
Mm.
Make sure
mm.
that you give yourself time to do the things that are going to feed you and feed your soul and restore your spirit. And, hopefully everyone has someone like that in their lives that can